We are today very pleased to is a thinker and writer on Korean issues, as well as for specific role in organizing here. Christian Osterman, who directs the Center's History and Public Policy program. It's a program which underscores this key mission that those acting in the money hand charge. How you think about the world affects how you act in the world. And if you don't know the historical context, how we got to know the world, it's a limitation on on developing prudent policies for the future. So in that spirit, let me lay out the basic thesis in my new book, which, as Professor Moon said, is available on the website of the Wilson Center at the popular price of free. You can download it. I have a few copies, brought a few copies with me. North Korea is on the verge of a nuclear breakout that would be a game changer. I call it a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis, because unlike Robert Kennedy's legendary 13 days in October 1962, this crisis will play out over the next 3 years. Within several years, North Korea could mount a miniaturized nuclear warhead on an intercontinental ballistic missile and strike the U.S. homeland. I know that South Korea has lived for many years with the vulnerability to North Korean attack, but the ability of North Korea to directly target the United States with a nuclear weapon, and they have some pretty kind of scary YouTubes. They're not the professional quality of the YouTube. I'll leave to others to judge, but is underscoring their drive to acquire this capability vis-a-vis the United States, and that could come to fruition within the next several years. Unclassified projections of North Korea's nuclear arsenal by 2020 range from 20 to 100 nuclear warheads. When I got into this field, I could not have imagined that North Korea would acquire a nuclear arsenal approaching 1/2 the size of Great Britain's. The unclassified number for Britain is in the 215 range. And North Korea is on a trajectory to acquire 100 if we don't change that trajectory by 2020, potentially. Now you could juxtapose that nuclear arsenal, a nuclear arsenal 1/2 the size of Great Britain's potentially, to the size of the North Korean economy, depending on how you measure it, by currency conversion or purchasing power parity. The range is $16 billion to $40 billion. That's about the size of Dayton, Ohio, or Asheville, North Carolina, to put it into context for the Americans when we want to talk about it back home. The North Korean economy is 1/50th the size of South Korea's economy. And anyone coming here periodically for visits, you cannot be but struck by the economic dynamism in this city and in this country, to the point where South Korea today has a GDP in the $1.3 trillion range, and juxtapose that to North Korea's economy of $40 billion. And this is in a region, the most dynamic region in the world. Japan, 4 trillion, China, 12 trillion, North Korea, a paltry $40 billion economy. So it's essentially a failed state with nuclear weapons. And I'll qualify what I mean by that. And it's ruled by, let's call it for what it is. It's a dynastic cult, the Kim family. And that leads to, I think, one of the major analytical points that I want to make that sets the scene for the analysis that will follow. And that is that the nuclear issue is embedded in the broader question of North Korea's societal evolution. The dilemma is that these timelines are not in sync. The nuclear challenge is immediate and urgent, while the prospects for regime change are uncertain. And the reason that I wrote the monograph, the short book, is precisely that urgency, is that we can't wait for an indeterminate regime change timeline to play out while the North Korean regime continues to acquire this breakout capability. And we can't base our policies on the assumption or vain hope of regime collapse. Recently, the
National Security Advisor, McMaster, referred to North Korea as a rogue state, rogue regime. And this was a departure from the Obama administration, which had referred to North Korea as an outlier state. And I don't know how rogue, outlier translate into Korean. And the point here is not some fetishism about language, but it's rather the contrasting policies that undergird these different terms. And they point towards the major divide in the US policy debate on states like Iran, North Korea, Libya, Iraq. And I want to just flesh that out a bit to provide context for the current crisis with North Korea. Professor Moon alluded to a period when I served on the National Security Council staff. And when I was there, the term rogue state entered the US foreign policy lexicon. And I work at an institution with many academics or people based at universities. This was not a term created by some academic to debate with his or her best friends in the field, in scholarly journals. This was the President of the United States asserting that rogue states constituted a distinct category of states in the international system. And the term entered the US foreign policy lexicon when I was on the National Security Council staff. So when I went back to the Wilson Center, I wanted to write about that experience in a way consistent with our mission, what Moynihan laid out as our mission. And it led to a series of publications on the issue of rogue states. And the first book, in what turned out to be a three-part series, focused on the inadequacy of the term rogue state as a way of thinking about a diverse group of countries that ranged from Libya to North Korea, Iran and Iraq. Very different political cultures. They would not normally be clustered as a group, but the term rogue state captured the concern in the 1990s coming from the 1991 Gulf War of the threat posed by a state such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the archetype rogue state pursuing weapons of mass destruction and pursuing terrorism, utilizing terrorism as an instrument of state policy. Those were the two criteria for rogue status. But to use a favorite word from the Soviet political lexicon, there were contradictions, and that the Clinton administration faced. The term was applied selectively. Who was a rogue state? Who decides who's a rogue state? So it was selectively applied. The United States, for domestic political reasons, it included Cuba often as a rogue state, which did not meet the criteria. But it would omit Syria, which was pursuing through its chemical programs, weapons of mass destruction, and it employed terrorism as an instrument of state policy. It met the criteria, but the Clinton administration omitted Syria because at that time Syria was needed for the Middle East peace process. So it was applied selectively. The term has no standing in international law, and the connotation rogue, it connotes a state that's beyond the pale. A state towards which you cannot pursue normal diplomacy because it is irredeemable, essentially. And the Clinton administration found itself painted into a corner. It was in a political straitjacket because once a country was put in the rogue category, it precluded normal diplomacy. And it needed to pursue diplomacy in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, 93, 94, there was the first nuclear crisis with North Korea over its plutonium program from the Yongbyon facility. This necessitated negotiations that led to the agreed framework, which was problematic, and for reasons we can get into, but was a first instance where the Clinton administration faced the necessity of engaging a rogue state. And then secondly, in 1996-7, when there was political shift in Iran, the rise of the first reformist president, Khatami, the Clinton administration wanted to explore the practical possibilities of engaging a reformist president, but it was confined by its own categorization. So over time, the Clinton administration jettisoned the term rogue state and in order to have greater diplomatic flexibility. Also, once one called a state a rogue state, it opened the door for domestic critics to argue that the United States was essentially pursuing a policy of appeasement, that the diplomatic contact with a rogue state was tantamount to appeasement. So the Clinton administration jettisoned the term only for the George W. Bush administration to bring it back after 2001. After the 9/11 attacks did not change the international system, but it led to a redefinition of threat. A threat focused on these two defining criteria for rogue status: weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And in particular, the nexus of the two, that you'd have a rogue state acquiring unconventional capabilities and either using them or giving them to a terrorist group that would have no political compunction against using them against the United States. This redefinition of threat led to a shift in strategy, because the threat was now defined by the Bush administration as linked to the character of regimes. The Bush administration argued that the threat derived from the character of the regimes: the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein, Kim regime in North Korea, Gaddafi, the Ayatollahs. And therefore, behavior change was inadequate. There was no benefit in pursuing diplomacy with these states to change their behavior if you left the regimes in power, because the dangerous behavior derived from the character of the regimes. Therefore, one needed to change regimes. That argumentation was central to the George W. Bush administration's case for the preventive war in Iraq in 2003. After the Iraq War, the Bush administration sent out a mixed message toward Iran and North Korea. It never clarified whether the U.S. objective was behavior change or regime change, and it achieved neither. The Iraq War was not a precedent that could be replicated. That is, the model of non-proliferation, coercive non-proliferation through regime change. Because once the toppling of Saddam Hussein was militarily the easy part of the mission, so to speak, that led to this bloody, attritional counterinsurgency campaign that the United States and allies found itself embroiled in 2004 through 2008-9, that period. And there was no there was no political support for replicating, so to speak, the Iraq model in any other country. Early after the fall of Saddam Hussein, there was some rhetoric about this as a warning to other regimes, but over a period of time, Iraq was clearly not a precedent that would be applied anywhere else. And when the United States could not do regime change, then the question was, would it be open to behavior change, of negotiations leading to behavior change? And indeed, the Bush administration had, through the European Union, negotiations with Iran on its nuclear program. There had been the announcement in 2003 of the Natanz enrichment facility that became public, that led to increased attention on the Iran nuclear program. And North Korea, you had the abrogation of the agreed framework in 2002-2003. North Korea acquires a small arsenal, estimated at 6 to 8 weapons in the last decade, and conducted its test in October 2006. Within that context, the Bush administration had pursued 6-party talks with North Korea that proved unsuccessful. They were not successful in limiting the North Korean program. We can go into kind of the reasons for that. But the Bush administration was trapped in this mixed message. It was not clear whether the U.S. objective was regime change or behavior change. It achieved neither. along comes President Obama, who campaigned controversially on a platform of engaging adversarial states. And he was criticized, Obama was criticized not just by his Republican presidential candidate, John McCain, but he was also criticized by his Democratic Party opponent, Hillary Clinton at the time. When Obama was inaugurated, he sought to reboot U.S. policy toward these states. He dropped the term rogue state because it was this unilateral American political concept, and instead he referred to Iran and North Korea as outlier states. And I had a book that came out in 2012 titled Outlier States that addresses this shift in policy. And again, this is not some fetishism about language. I'm not going postmodernist on you with some, taking literary theory and applying it to international relations. You can make it, that's a cottage industry in international relations right now, but I'm basically focusing on that the shift in terminology reflected major policy difference. And if you wanted to kind of look at the optic, I come from Washington. I'm not going to tell you, this group, what's going on in this country, let alone even what's going on in North Korea, as difficult it is. I can talk to you about the policy debate in Washington. If one wants to look at the prism, the optic for looking at the debate in Washington, it's this persisting divide that's been there since 9/11 of whether U.S. policy towards states such as North Korea and Iran should be to change regimes or to change their behavior. We are locked in this persisting kind of debate that's unresolved. And I'll trace how this debate is playing out. The Obama administration shifted to a policy of engagement and pressure. There was a metaphor in President Obama's inaugural address where he said, "We will extend a hand if you will unclench your fist." That was a message for Iran and North Korea. North Korea did not unclench the fist and did not respond to the Obama administration's overtures. They tested a ballistic missile, conducted additional nuclear tests, ballistic missiles. They were going through a regime transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. There are perhaps domestic political reasons why North Korea was not then receptive to these overtures, but the bottom line was that the Obama administration, after a time, kind of gave up on North Korea. That's too strong. I mean, they would not accept that terminology. But their emphasis shifted from North Korea to Iran, where they saw the possibility of attaining a nuclear agreement. It was really they did not. Strategic patience was applying pressure on North Korea so that when it came back to the table, they would discuss the agenda of denuclearization. And it was, as I'll discuss, the strategic patience over time, it really became acquiescence to North Korea continuing to build up. And it's that point that we're at right now which gives urgency to the North Korean case. But I'm anticipating where I'm going on this. Let me just develop the Iran point a bit further, because it really points to a precedent, a useful precedent that may be applicable to the North Korean case. In 2013, a reformist president was elected in Iran. And they're facing another election in several days. And whatever... Are you having trouble hearing me?
It's today.
Oh, it's today. Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry, I crossed the international date line, so my today, tomorrow is a little... I'm over the mid-Pacific right now. My brain. But today's the first round, and then there'll be a subsequent round. The point, though, is there are real politics in Iran. The politics in Iran are more real than many other countries in the Middle East, if you look particularly the monarchies. It's confined politics. They veto certain candidates, but there is a certain contested space in Iran in the campaign, such that a Rouhani could come to office. And he came to power, and I guess the nuclear deal that's being voted on today today's election is almost a referendum on what the Iranian people, in part, think about that. Rouhani came to office with a mandate to resolve the economic sanctions that Iran was under, that President Obama described as crippling. And they were significant. That one of the advantages of going from a unilateral policy to a multilateral policy, that once the United States dropped the term rogue state, and Obama made it clear that the United States was going to pursue a multilateral approach focused on behavior changes in policy. That became the basis for then getting multilateral support from the Europeans, and even the Russians and the Chinese. That regime change, because of the principle of state sovereignty, is highly controversial in international relations. I mean, when Tanzania overthrew Idi Amin, you couldn't have a more unsympathetic character than that. Or when Vietnam overthrew the Pol Pot regime. Or, if I may say, even when the Bush administration overthrew Saddam Hussein. I mean, Saddam Hussein was, was as brutal and autocratic leader as they come. Because of the principle of state sovereignty, this is highly controversial in international law. The United States, once it dropped regime change as the objective, it became possible to build support to mount meaningful pressure on Iran. The banking sanctions that the European Union adopted, the sanctions on the oil sector that were really biting the Iranian economy. The changes that occurred in the banking system, just to go back to the first, in their ability, or rather the inability of Iranian commercial entities to just conduct business because they did not have access to international banking. Iran is much more plugged into the international economic system than North Korea. It sells oil on the market. Those oil revenues were being held in escrow accounts. Iran wanted access to those accounts. Very different circumstances, of course, between these two countries that we lump together often in our categories of thinking about states and the proliferation, on the issue of proliferation. Rouhani had a limited mandate from Iran's supreme leader, whose title I think we have to take at face value. I mean, he is the supreme leader. There are politics in Iran, but he has to make the decision to approve whether or not a deal can proceed. What he approved were negotiations limited to just the nuclear deal. Not Iran's support for Hezbollah, not Iran's domestic political system and its human rights abuses, not all of the other issues that we have with Iran. And the Obama administration debated this. If the United States had pushed for broad negotiations, success on the nuclear issue would not have been possible. A prerequisite for the successful outcome was the limited scope of the nuclear negotiations to just that question. The Obama administration decoupled the nuclear question from the question of regime change. And recall at the top of my arguments, I argued that the dilemma is that the nuclear issue has been embedded in the question of societal change. And these timelines are not in sync. The nuclear timeline, the regime change timeline. And therefore, the pragmatic approach was decouple the issues. Just focus on the nuclear issue to cap, to freeze, to constrain Iran's nuclear capabilities, which of course are far more rudimentary than what North Korea has. With Iran, the focus of the negotiations was on preventing North Korean access to weapons usable material through its uranium enrichment program, primarily. They had a reactor that could have generated plutonium, but it wasn't not yet operational. But they have an active uranium enrichment program, and the goal there was block Iran's access to weapons usable material. And the administration said, we need a year's warning, that if they were to get out of the agreement, we would have a 1-year warning before they acquired weapons usable material, highly enriched uranium. And the United States would also need an inspection regime such that if Iran were to develop a covert facility, that we would be able to likely detect cheating. Or at least the Iranians could not bet on the possibility that the United States would not detect cheating. There'd be a high incentive, or there'd be a strong disincentive for cheating, given the inspection regime. But here's the crux, and going back to the main point I was making about the U.S. debate after 9/11. When the Iran nuclear accord was concluded, it was just that. It was a deal, not a grand bargain with Iran. It focused on the nuclear program. It constrains Iran's access to weapons usable material for 15 years. And that was the point of both of praise for the deal and criticism of the deal. Proponents of the deal said, this buys us 15 years. And we'll see what happens in 15 years. Maybe Iran will be in a different place. Going back to the two timelines. The opponents of the deal argued, yeah, it only buys 15 years. And at the end of 15 years, this regime is still going to be in power with access to potentially to weapons usable material. It's not good enough. When the critics of the Iran deal called for a better deal, I'm using American air quotes, and as the English would say, inverted commas, the better deal camp really never specified what this better deal was. On the day that Obama became president, there were already 19,000 there were 19,000 installed centrifuges in Iran. A lot of them were spinning and producing enriched uranium. This deal limits Iran to 5,000 active centrifuges. It blocks modernization for a decade, and Iran's access to highly enriched uranium for 15 years. Iran is permitted to a limited stock of low enriched uranium. The better deal people, those advocating for the better deal, they never really said what this better deal was. What would a better deal have been? 4,000 centrifuges? 3,000 centrifuges? 0 centrifuges was not an option. We were not going to get a deal with Iran that would leave them with 0 centrifuges spinning. But 5,000 was too many. The crux of the criticism was that the deal left this regime in power. And when one looks at the criticism there's been of the deal, and President Obama, it was reflected in President Trump's comment about the Iran nuclear deal several weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, where he said the State Department had written to the Congress stipulating that Iran was in compliance with this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as it's called, the formal name of the Iran nuclear deal. It's in compliance. President Trump said, when asked about this, that Iran was in compliance, but it was not living up to the spirit of the agreement. Okay, what's the spirit of the agreement? The spirit of the agreement was really referring to all the things that are outside of the agreement. What it's doing in Syria, what it's doing in Iraq, what it's doing in Yemen, its abuse of human rights records. So this is the context for the Iran nuclear deal, going back to this divide that I pointed to in the U.S. debate. So why am I talking about Iran in Seoul, dealing with North Korea? It's because it's a useful precedent for addressing the North Korean case, and the issues that have arisen vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear accord would come up in the North Korean context. It would be the structure of the debate about nuclear diplomacy with North Korea in the United States will be the same as the reactions to nuclear diplomacy with Iran. And you'd see proponents and opponents of nuclear diplomacy along these lines. Strategic patience, has led to acquiescence, essentially. North Korea has built up, continued. Look at the tempo of its testing last year. 2 nuclear tests, 25 ballistic missile tests. This is a very active program. This isn't just occasional tests. It's really accelerating. In the past, the United States, part of strategic patience was that the United States wanted North Korea to stipulate up front that it was committed to the goal of denuclearization and that it would come back into compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which North Korea had been a party. North Korea said they would come to the table if they were recognized as a nuclear weapon state, which is not, successive administrations have said is not going to happen. And this has been the impasse that has prevented nuclear diplomacy. This is one of the impasses of nuclear diplomacy with North Korea. I think that's a gap we pay diplomats to resolve, to get the parties to the negotiating table. So what are the options on North Korea? And Professor Moon, I'm heading into the concluding part of my talk here. So, and then we'll go over to the comments and questions from the floor. So what are the options? Basically, there are three. Bomb, negotiate, or acquiesce. The much discussed military option on the table to attack North Korean sites has been rejected because of its catastrophic risks. And that risk is it could trigger a second, this time nuclear, Korean War. The former U.S. commander of U.S. forces in Korea in the 90s, General Gary Luck, estimated that a conflict would have 1 million casualties and entail a cost of $1 trillion. And that was in the mid-90s. You can just imagine what the casualties and the costs of a conflict now would be. And I worked on the National Security Council staff doing pro and con memos for the president on different options. And when one of the cons is, could trigger, people talk about, how about a limited strike just on a specific missile complex or a particular site in North Korea. One of the cons would be this could trigger a general war on the Korean Peninsula. And that is a showstopper, in terms of the military option, I think. It's on the table, but it's a very bad option, and it would be, it's difficult to see the circumstances where it would be undertaken short of the outbreak of a war. Meanwhile, while the military option has its problems, U.S. hardline critics have castigated diplomacy as being tantamount to appeasement, for the reason I said. And people in the United States will say, the Kim Jong-un regime is irrational, it's a crazy regime, etc. And look at its odious human rights record. Do not engage them because you're propping up an odious regime. And up to now, increasing pressure, squeezing North Korea harder, has not been possible because the Chinese won't cooperate with a strategy that they view as running the risk of regime collapse. That's their interest. They want to preserve a buffer state between the Republic of Korea and China. With North Korea already possessing a nuclear arsenal estimated in the mid-teens, maybe a dozen, there is no good option. What then is the least bad alternative? When the United States can't bomb and it won't negotiate, it is in fact acquiescing to a continued North Korean buildup. In my new book, Preventing North Korea's Nuclear Breakout, I argue that political space may exist for a pivot to serious diplomacy through what I call coercive engagement. The Iran nuclear deal was a deal, not a grand bargain. And for those of you who went through public policy schools, you'll recall the classic distinction between transactional and transformational policies. The Iran nuclear deal was transactional. It was not transformational. And that became the basis of the criticism of the deal for the reasons that I mentioned. Similarly, nuclear diplomacy with North Korea would be transactional. It would focus on the discrete nuclear issue with the objective of freezing North Korean capabilities at their current level. And this, analytically, one can identify the possibility that this objective may be attainable. That would make the best of a bad situation. When zero warheads is not on the table, a deal that leaves an agreement that caps North Korea at 20 nuclear weapons is better than an unconstrained program that reaches 100 warheads by 2020. And a freeze would preclude the additional testing that North Korea still needs to master the miniaturization of warheads and their reentry and reliable long-range missiles. So why should diplomacy succeed this time when it has failed in the past? That's a fair question. The new factor which may permit diplomacy to succeed now when it has failed in the past is China, which can no longer be a cost-free enabler of North Korea through its lackadaisical enforcement of sanctions. Because a North Korean nuclear breakout would be a game changer not only for Washington, but also for Beijing. China's calculus of decision must now take into account the adverse strategic consequences of the North's emergence as a major nuclear power. And those consequences, and I'd be very interested in views from this group on this, those consequences could conceivably include South Korea and Japan reassessing their non-nuclear status, of not wanting to live in a neighborhood where their primary adversary has 100 nuclear weapons, and sole reliance on the United States for extended deterrence. I think that question would invariably come up in this transformed future context of North Korea with 100 nuclear weapons. As with Iran, transactional diplomacy would decouple the nuclear issue from that of regime change. And it would create the conditions for success not by maximizing the interests of any party, or let alone all the parties, but it would optimize the interests of ours. And life is, more often than not, it's an optimizing function, not a maximizing function. We all know that from the choices we make in any context that we deal with, colleagues, family, whatever. It would create the conditions for success by optimizing the interests, okay? So what are those optimized interests? For North Korea, I'm talking the freeze here. For North Korea, a freeze would permit Pyongyang to retain a minimum deterrent, small number that it has, and the Kim family regime would stay in power. For South Korea, it would buy time, capping North Korea at its current levels and seeing under the new administration what policies are possible to potentially transform the North-South relationship, or at least to improve that relationship. For China, a freeze, as I've argued kind of at length now, it would preserve the buffer state in North Korea while averting the adverse strategic consequences of a North Korean breakout. And for the United States, this interim agreement preventing the breakout, the U.S. administration would argue the narrative, again, kind of a postmodernist term, the narrative would be that the United States was not accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but rather this was an interim step, freezing capabilities toward the long-term objective of denuclearizing the North Korean peninsula, denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. I think this analytical option should be put to the diplomatic test. Now, transactional diplomacy to freeze North Korea's capabilities would invariably generate criticism. Transactional diplomacy would generate criticism because it's not transformational. First, it would leave North Korea with its current nuclear arsenal, now estimated at a dozen weapons. And second, there's the moral hazard argument, that it would leave the odious Kim regime in power doing what it does. And those, you have to acknowledge, would be the costs of transactional diplomacy with North Korea. So where does the Trump administration stand? A senator coming out of a White House briefing 2 weeks ago said that the senior official who'd done the briefing had highlighted the grave threat, but had failed to lay out a strategy to address the threat. President Trump has warned of a major conflict with North Korea, quote unquote, if diplomacy fails, while Secretary Tillerson has stated that Washington's precondition for direct negotiations with Pyongyang is essentially the outcome the United States seeks, which is North Korea's denuclearization. Yet after the United States regime-changing military interventions in Iraq and Libya, the Kim Jong-un regime is not going to relinquish nuclear weapons it views as essential to its survival. That's why zero is not on the table as an option. Secretary Tillerson told the UN Security Council 2 weeks ago, that the U.S. objective is not regime change. Now, that statement seemed to have been made as a way of getting China on board for concerted policies to put pressure on North Korea. And if the U.S. objective is regime change, we lose the Chinese. So that one could interpret that's how one could interpret the Tillerson statement. The Trump administration thus faces the choice of pivoting to the alternative of denuclearization. Full denuclearization is not feasible in the near term. And that alternative is an imperfect nuclear deal that would freeze North Korean nuclear and missile capabilities at their current level. And as I've argued, ironically, the model here is the Iran nuclear agreement. Ironically, candidate Trump called the Iran nuclear deal the worst deal ever negotiated. But the irony is that's the precedent for dealing with North Korea now. Secretary Tillerson has rejected the Iran nuclear deal as a relevant precedent. As he put it, the Iran nuclear accord represents the same failed approach of the past that brought us to the current imminent threat we face in North Korea, close quote. As with the Iran nuclear deal, a freeze with North Korea, just to hammer home my main conclusion, it would be transactional, not transformational. The open question is whether President Trump, who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, would take such an imperfect nuclear deal. Otherwise, the administration is left with the bad alternatives of bombing or acquiescing. Thank you for your attention. Sorry to go long.
It's okay, it's very informative. Okay, now open the floor. I won't make any kind of comments of my own. Yes, Chairman Kim?
Thank you, Dr. Litwak, for your very illuminating